Today, I'm comparing two of the San Francisco Peninsula's most sought after communities to each other, Burlingame and San Carlos. Both are super awesome places to live, but there are some key differences. So I'm gonna share with you why I think you might be drawn to one versus the other, what the real estate is like, so you can kind of make the best decision for you. And to get a good sense of what it's like to live in San Mateo County, check out my videos every Monday at 5. So let's dive in. So let's start out with a couple similarities. It's really interesting. Burlingame has about 31,000 people according to the census from 2023, and San Carlos has 30,000 people. And then I thought, well, okay, maybe the towns are a little bit different in size geographically speaking. So I looked it up. It turns out that each town is about the same size of 6 square miles. I mean, these towns are so similar. So now let's talk a little bit about the park. So for example, over here, we're in Washington Park right now in Burlingame. This is the community center, and this is a $52 million structure that just opened a couple years ago. I'm super proud of it. It's beautiful. Check out my video all about downtown Burlingame and Washington Park if you want to kind of get a deeper dive inside here. But this is a hub for the community. We're in the Burlingame Gables neighborhood, which is cool. You can just kind of walk over here, you're in the heart of the neighborhood. Over here is the Lion Hogue neighborhood. And from this area, we are very close to downtown Burlingame and Burlingame Avenue. And then over here, we've got the basketball courts where, you know, this is a lot of fun. Going out here with our son, shooting hoops sometimes. And then this doubles for pickleball. Over here, we have a beautiful baseball field, which is where Burlingame High School's campus. It's actually just out there in the distance. It's lit at night, and then you can play t-ball here for kids and softball. It's just a great place to be. And then over here, we have the park itself, or the playground part, and then the Lions Club over there. And then just a few blocks away is downtown Burlingame and Burlingame Avenue, Caltrain stop, all that. Now if we were to kind of compare this to downtown San Carlos, the big park there is called Burton Park. I will mention in Burlingame there's about 19 parks and almost as many in San Carlos. But kind of like here we have Washington Park, in San Carlos there's Burton Park, and that's also a huge hub for the community. It's a massive piece of real estate. There's a kind of a smaller community center there. There's a huge baseball field. There's a playground. There's basketball courts that are super popular. Here we have 10-foot basketball hoops, but there's an 8-foot hoop. So I think that's kind of cool. Although there is one park in Burlingame, in the Burlingame Park neighborhood, where there's an 8-foot hoop. So kind of cool. From a community building perspective, both towns, in my opinion, do an incredible job of having lots of events throughout the year. So there's wine events, there's art fairs. San Carlos has something called Hometown Days, which is very popular. These fields get a ton of use year round, but of course, mostly in the spring, summer, and fall. And actually, Burlingame Parks and Rec even does a family camp out here in August, which is super popular. And you'll see like over 100 tents out here, kids camping. And then at the Lions Club, they'll do a community breakfast here with pancakes, and it's super fun. So like I was saying, Burlingame has 19 public parks and San Carlos has 16 public parks. And let's just give you a quick idea of how beautiful these parks are. So for example, in San Carlos, there's Arguello Park, which is 21 acres. That is kind of about halfway up the hill. There's Big Canyon Park, Burton Park, Cedar Street Park, Chilton Park, City Hall Dog Park, Crestview Park, Eaton Park, Harrington Park, which is super small, Highlands Park, Hillcrest Circle Park, Loreola Park, North Crestview, Rosec, San Carlos Avenue Park, Vista Park, and that is the list. And of course we have Washington Park, which is a destination for lots of people who don't even live in Burlingame. It's just very popular on the weekends. And then some of the other parks in Burlingame, we have Bayside Park, which is super popular for baseball and soccer, and dad softball right out by the bay. Cuernavaca Park, right up in the Mills Estates neighborhood with beautiful bay views. Heritage Park, which is near the Burlingame Library. Paloma Park in the Burlingame Terrace neighborhood. Pershing Park in the Burlingame Park neighborhood, which has that 8-foot basketball hoop. Ray Park in northern Burlingame, which just had a major renovation and is super popular. Village Park, which is where I had my 3rd birthday party and just had a major renovation as well, very beautiful. Victoria Park in the Lion Hogue neighborhood. The Burlingame Golf Center, which just had a new Topgolf that opened up, and that's pretty cool. Hoover Park, Franklin Park right at Franklin Elementary School, and of course we have Coyote Point Recreation Area, which is technically in San Mateo, but it's on the Burlingame border, so we're throwing that in and counting it for this video because you should absolutely check it out. There's a marina, hiking trails, and that's kind of the start of the Bay Trail, which goes all the way down from Burlingame to Oracle in Redwood Shores, and regardless of where you choose to buy, it's just a great place to check out. So from a location perspective, you kind of have Burlingame on the North Peninsula, San Carlos on the Mid Peninsula. I think the big decision or the big thing why you would choose one town or the other could be basically where you work. So if you work from home, like no big deal, live whichever town you think you're gonna enjoy or buy a different town. But if you kind of work like in the city, or you and your spouse with their significant other kind of work up there, or you're in biotech in South City and you're both kind of heading more in the north direction, San Carlos might feel a little bit far because the traffic kind of can back up around 101, 92, 101 and Hillsdale Boulevard during rush hour. If you don't have to deal with rush hour traffic and you're just going in 1 or 2 days a week, I don't think it matters which town you live in. If you work in big tech in the South Bay, so you're going down to Mountain View, Cupertino, Sunnyvale, you're at Apple, Google, Adobe, I mean, any of the companies that are down there, San Carlos would be a lot more pleasant of a commute. And I say pleasant as in less worse. I once had some clients who, home I sold in Burlingame, and both of them worked at Apple. And to go from basically Burlingame all the way down to Sunnyvale, even on 280, which is great, people don't complain, it just was far. So then they ended up selling their house there and then moving down to Los Altos Hills. So I think the goal is, obviously no one wants to sit in traffic, so just pick the area that's gonna be a little bit more comfortable for you. But if that's not a big deal, then just buy the town you like more. I've been getting a number of questions recently from YouTube viewers who are just kind of wondering, well, how do I kind of pick like which town in the peninsula is gonna give me among the best community feel out there? And I feel like Burlingame and San Carlos are at the top of this list, which is why I'm kind of putting them head to head a little bit in this video. But from a real estate perspective, that's gonna kind of matter a lot based on whatever your budget is. And that's kind of how I would think about it. Burlingame is gonna be a little bit more expensive than San Carlos. Expensive doesn't mean better, it just means more expensive, right? And because you're gonna get a ton of different opinions from a lot of different people. You can talk to people who lived in Burlingame their whole life and like, Burlingame's the best. And you can talk to people like some of my closest friends grew up in San Carlos and they say that's the best place that you could ever live. So, I mean, you can't go wrong in either spot. But when we talk about the real estate, we had average prices in 2024 in Burlingame were about $3 million, median price about $2.8 million. And then in San Carlos, average prices last year were about $2,560,000, and the median price last year was about $2.4 million. And then when we look at condos in Burlingame, average and median condo prices are roughly similar at about $1.2 million. And in San Carlos, average is about 1.3, but median's about 1.2. You know, pretty meaningful difference. You're gonna get, you know, depending on the day and price per square foot and all that, you're probably gonna get 10 to 20% better price per square foot in San Carlos than you will in Burlingame. So if you're just trying to optimize from a lower pricing standpoint, then I'd go San Carlos. But if you're okay paying that Burlingame premium and the numbers feel comfortable with you, obviously that's another option for you to consider too, and it just would give you a little bit more choice. So I thought it'd be really interesting if we kind of looked at Burlingame and San Carlos from an appreciation perspective on median home prices over the last 4 years, over the last 10 years, and over the last 20 years. And you see something very interesting. Burlingame over the last 4 years had median appreciation of about 10%. San Carlos had median appreciation about 16%. And then if we go back over the last 10 years, we can see Burlingame had median price appreciation of about 69%. And San Carlos was also 69%. Very interesting. When we look back over the last 20 years, we can see that Burlingame had appreciation of about 159%, and then San Carlos had appreciation of about 190%. So could you say, well, historically speaking, San Carlos has appreciated a lot more than Burlingame over the last 20 years? I think the answer is yes. Why do I think that's the case though? Burlingame has always been a little bit more expensive just because it's closer to San Francisco from a job center perspective. Now, if you might be wondering why are prices kind of going through the roof in both of these towns, we kind of ended 2024 with record pricing across the board in San Mateo County. And each town is pretty much near its peak. And it's very interesting. Last year we had 169 homes sell in Burlingame, which was the second fewest number of sales basically in history going back to about 2000, because that's how far back we have data from the MLS. But if you look at San Carlos, 2024 was actually the fewest number of sales ever with 219. So Burlingame was 169, San Carlos was 219. And this is again just for single family homes. And I think this is really interesting because again, Burlingame, second fewest number, San Carlos, fewest number last year. And when you have a little supply like that, I mean, prices go up. And it's interesting because over the last 15 years, the most number of sales Burlingame has ever had in 1 year, it's been about 250 or so. San Carlos has gotten close to 400. So as that supply in San Carlos has dropped, that's why we've seen such this massive gain in pricing there. And I think a lot of it just has to do with what the supply is in San Carlos. So when we kind of think about the downtowns in both Burlingame and San Carlos, they are probably the two best downtowns in the peninsula. I mean, San Mateo is incredible. So I wouldn't say one is actually better than the other. I would say Burlingame and San Carlos feel more small town downtown, and San Mateo just feels like small town, big town downtown. I don't know if that all makes sense, but basically San Mateo, you know, town of 100,000 people, and you have a series of about 4 blocks by 4 blocks where there's over 171 different restaurants and shops and all that, and you kind of get everything there. You're gonna get a little bit less in Burlingame and San Carlos than you will compared to San Mateo, but again, who's counting how many restaurants can you go to every so often? Even my wife and I, we go out for a couple date nights a month, and it's gonna take us years to go to all these different restaurants. So forget the city. Although I do love the city, I lived there for 8 years in my 20s, but we got such good food down here. So we kind of think about the differences between the downtowns of both Burlingame and San Carlos. Both are gonna be top destinations if you just wanna go out on a date night, you just wanna walk around with friends or kids, or go out with your in-laws, whatever it is, it's just really flat, it's walkable, it's just one long downtown. So for example, we're on Laurel Street right now in downtown. Oh yeah, Clock Tower Music. We actually, check out my Downtown San Carlos video where you can kind of learn a little bit more about them. But so what's nice about San Carlos is it feels a little bit more mom and pop than Burlingame. Burlingame certainly has that, but in San Carlos, you're just gonna get a little bit more of a collection of different kinds of businesses. Downtown Burlingame, you're gonna get an Apple store, you're gonna get a Athleta, a Lululemon. You're not really gonna see that here. There is one store that sells all that here, but you're not getting those big brands that you're gonna see in downtown Burlingame in San Carlos. So I feel like San Carlos is a little bit more what Burlingame maybe was like 20 years ago. I remember growing up in Burlingame, a lot more mom and pops, and I feel like San Carlos really excels from that perspective, where here you can go and you can meet a lot of the shop owners, as I have, like kind of doing these different YouTube videos, and it's just been really fun and rewarding for me, going into talking to the guy selling the olive oil, or going to the reading bug. So I'd say San Carlos would take the cake if you're looking for like small town downtown. And then Burlingame though, I mean, it's hard to argue with that too. So many different good places to eat, bakeries galore, tons of people always out and about. If you were to pick one town on the whole peninsula, that if you went out at like a Saturday at 11 a.m., where's there gonna be the most number of people? It's probably gonna be downtown Burlingame, probably then downtown San Mateo, and then probably downtown San Carlos. That would be my guess. And then if we move a little bit more south, then it's gonna be University Ave in Palo Alto. So in my experience, most people would either prefer to live in a flatter neighborhood or in a hillier neighborhood. So when we kind of think about the differences between Burlingame and San Carlos, obviously the towns are in different locations, but they have like great community feels, very similar vibes. But a big decision point is, do you wanna live again in the flats, or do you wanna kind of be more up in the hills? If you're in the flats, then it's gonna be a lot more trick-or-treatable. You're like, okay, I wanna teach my kid how to ride a bike here, or it's very accessible for people with strollers or wheelchairs or whatever. It's also very close to public transportation. So the flatter areas have a lot of benefits over the hills. But if you really value privacy and being closer to 280 and maybe some views and a bit of a lower price per square foot, then the hills are gonna be a good option. So I just wanna give you a quick idea how many homes sold in both the flatter areas of each town and the hillier areas of each town based on the number of bedrooms, which I think is very interesting, and that's data that most people just really aren't thinking about, because that'll give you an idea. Okay, if I knew how many 3-bedroom homes were selling in the hills of San Carlos or in the hills of Burlingame, that might give me a good idea on setting my expectations for how likely is it that I can get what I want. So for example, in 2024 for Burlingame, there were 169 sales the whole year. So if we're to look in Burlingame, how many were in the hills? There were 34 sales. If we look at how many homes in Burlingame sold in all the flat neighborhoods combined, that was 135. So if we look in San Carlos last year, there were 91 homes that sold up in the hills, and there were 126 sales in the flatter areas. And then if we were to look at the distribution within Burlingame, it's pretty fascinating. So there were, if you're looking for a 5-bedroom home, there were 13 sales in the flatter areas and 6 in the hills. 4 bedrooms, 50 sales in the flats and 14 up in the hills for a 3-bedroom. 56 in the flatter areas and 12 up in the hills. And then for 2-bedroom homes, 16 in the flatter areas, and only 2 up in the hills of Burlingame. Now, if we look in San Carlos, for 5-bedroom homes, there were 10 that were up in the hills and 4 that were in the flatter neighborhoods. There were 42 4-bedrooms that sold in the hills and 35 in the flatter areas, 33 3-bedroom homes in the hills and 59 more in the flatter areas. And for 2-bedroom homes, basically 26 were in the flatter areas and 5 in hillier areas. So again, this isn't perfect analysis since I'm not looking at gradation of the streets and the topography and all that, but that just hopefully gives you an idea on the concentration of where these homes are. For example, if you want a 2-bedroom home, you're just not gonna be able to get that in the hills. It's gonna be in a flatter area. So in San Carlos, there are 4 public elementary schools, and in Burlingame, there are 6 public elementary schools. So in San Carlos, there's Arundel Elementary, Britton Acres Elementary, Heather Elementary, and White Oaks Elementary. And then in San Carlos, there's 2 public middle schools, Central and Tierra Linda. And then in Burlingame, there's 6 public elementary schools. There's Lincoln, Roosevelt, Franklin, Washington, McKinley, and Hoover. And then there's 1 public middle school, BIS, Burlingame Intermediate School. And then from a high school perspective, Burlingame just has 1 public high school, Burlingame High School, that's where I went. And in San Carlos, there's no public high school in the city itself. There's actually Carlmont, which is in Belmont, which is a mashup between the words San Carlos and Belmont. And then the other high school that serves kind of the southwestern part of the city is gonna be Sequoia in Redwood City. All right, so it's kind of a loaded question for the topic of this video, but I do like it because I feel it is fair to compare Burlingame and San Carlos. But if we think about all the different places that you could live in California or the Bay Area, Burlingame and San Carlos would be at the top of my list for places that you could choose to live in. There's so many more similarities than there are differences. And I think many people are surprised if they go spend some time in any of the downtowns or go to the parks on the weekend or sporting events at the parks or just talking to people here. I think you'd find everyone is really normal, really fun, a lot of laid back folks, and it's just the quality of life in both these towns are so high. So I've been getting a lot of questions from YouTube, people like you guys, about which place makes the most sense. And I feel like you just can't go wrong in either place. But if you're trying to optimize on the dollars, then you want to roll in San Carlos. And if your price point is maybe a little bit more flexible, I mean, I know these are all massive numbers, but if it's a little more flexible, maybe you kind of consider both towns. Now, I know if you're watching this, you might be thinking about, is Burlingame a good option for me or San Carlos? Or you just think about maybe you want to buy somewhere in San Mateo County. And I know how hard it is because I went through that. Even though I grew up in Burlingame, I wasn't kind of sure exactly how things would work out. I lived in the city for 8 years in my 20s and did a ton of research. Burlingame, San Mateo, South, like where I wanted to be kind of when I grew up and buy my first place. So you might be thinking about price range, neighborhoods, commuting, size of house. Like, are you okay with brown countertops in your kitchen and a pink tile bathroom? Like, we kind of were when we bought our first place. I wasn't that excited about it, but we got it. And so if that's something that you're kind of going through in that process, I'd love to be a resource for you. All my contact info is below. Feel free to reach out to me.